So, throughout this week, we have been studying tall tales. And if you remember, tall tales are stories that have what would normally be regular people, but they have extreme, exaggerated strength. And so, we've already read about John Henry and how he worked his way on the railroad line and he beat the machine. And then yesterday we read about um, Pecos Bill, and Pecos Bill wrangled the wild Mustang, the wild horse, to ride him. So today we're going to be reading about probably one of the most famous tall tale characters that I know. That is Paul Bunyan. So let's look at that. As we're reading, we've been talking about making inferences. So we'll kind of stop and make some inferences as we are reading this text. So this is Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox. Paul Bunyan was a giant lumberjack. He stood 63 axe handles high, give or take a handle. When Paul shouted, "Timber!" and swung his axe, 100 trees would fall. Back in Paul's day, America was growing fast and people needed wood to build houses and towns. Farmers needed wild land cleared so they could grow crops. So again, this is probably an exaggeration. 100 trees would fall with the swing of one axe. Not realistic. Paul showed an early talent for knocking down trees. As a baby, he rolled over in his sleep one night and knocked down a mile of Maine forest. He always knew he'd be a lumberjack, and soon it was time to follow his dream. "I'm off to log the North Woods," he told his parents. "Good luck, son," they said. "Watch where you step." Paul got a job at a logging camp. Chopping down trees was easy, but he wished he had someone to help him haul the logs to the river. Then came the winter of the blue snow. Beautiful blue snow fell for days. Paul came across a snowdrift as big as a house with 2 hairy blue ears sticking out of it. "Moo!" it softly bellowed. Paul lifted those ears, and out came a sickly baby ox that had been stuck in the snow. The ox was blue all over from the cold. Paul brought the ox back to camp and cared for him all night. In the morning, the ox was feeling better, but he stayed blue. He licked Paul on the neck. Paul laughed. "I'll call you Babe," he said. So here, I'm kind of making an inference that Paul is going to take care of Babe, right? He kind of named him already. I think Babe wants to stay with him because I know that, like, when my dog is happy to see me, he'll come up and lick me. So I see that there's like a friendship. I'm making an inference that there's a friendship. They went off to Michigan, where Paul set up his own logging camp. Babe grew like crazy and soon was so big that folks could hardly see him end to end. None of the local watering holes were big enough for Babe to drink from. Paul solved that problem by using his axe to dig the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes are a set of big lakes in the United States. So here it's kind of like a folk tale in a sense that it's describing how these lakes were made. So almost even a myth, an American myth. Paul's logging camp was filled with hundreds of lumberjacks. They were a hungry bunch, and their favorite food was pancakes. "More pancakes," they'd call, but the cooks couldn't make enough. Sourdough Sam, the chief cook, feared that the men would quit if they didn't get more pancakes. "Don't worry, Sam. I'll solve this," Paul said. Paul sat and thought about the problem a while. Then he and Babe disappeared. About a week later, Babe returned to camp pulling an iron griddle. It's like a big pan that you use. This is the griddle. That griddle was a mile wide if it was an inch. Paul had it built in the big city. When Sam saw the griddle, his eyes nearly popped out of his head. "Now we're cooking," he cried. Again, this is an exaggeration. No way could this ox carry a griddle or a pan that's as long as a mile. Paul ordered a fire built under the griddle. Babe, eager to help, drank all the water out of a lake. The cooks used the empty lake bed as a bowl to mix the batter in. Men strapped slabs of bacon onto their boots and skated around on the griddle. When it was all greased up, the cooks poured their batter. Soon, 500,000 pancakes were bubbling on the griddle. There was even a pipeline of syrup going straight to the tables. The lumberjacks were finally happy, and no one ever quit Paul's camp. Those pancakes were too good. When the logging was done in one spot, Paul simply lifted the camp onto wheels and Babe pulled it to a new place. One time, they set down their camp next to a Twisty River in Wisconsin. That river was so crooked that the lumberjacks sent floating down would end up in an awful jam. For weeks at a time, the sawmills downriver were waiting for logs that never came. So the logs were all coming here and they all got stuck. So the people further down the river weren't getting anything. Paul sat picking his teeth with a pine tree while he thought about the problem. Again, another exaggeration to show us how huge he is. He uses a tree as a toothpick. Paul had Ole, his blacksmith, forge a giant chain. He hooked one end of the chain to Babe's harness and the other end to a twist in the river. "Pull, Babe," he commanded, and Babe pulled. Sweat poured off Babe, but the river wouldn't budge. "Harder," Paul said. Babe grunted and pulled harder. The muscles on his neck stood out like tree roots. His legs dug in the earth and his belly nearly touched the ground. But that old river was as crooked as ever. Then Paul saw the bend in the river give a shiver. "It's working," he cried. Babe let out a bellow that was heard all the way to Kansas. He gave a mighty tug, causing the river to snap like a whip. Then with a crack, it lay straight as a flagpole. Everyone cheered. Paul stuck out his chest with pride so much that his buttons popped off his shirt. So again, another tall tale exaggeration that an ox pulled a river straight. Paul and Babe went on to do many more great things. They were last seen working in the vast wilderness of Alaska. Folks up there say they still sometimes hear the mighty voice in the woods calling out, "Timber!" followed by a rumbling moo. All right, so here are some of the words. You can pause and take a look if you didn't know any of these words. Batter, forge, griddle, harness, logging camp, lumberjack, syrup, and talent. Okay, so that is our story for today. Hope you enjoyed.